The air inside the abandoned orange grove was cold and unmoving when deputies lifted the tarp, revealing soil disturbed days earlier, a single shoe half buried, and the unmistakable silence that follows realization, when trained investigators know a missing person search has ended and a homicide inquiry has quietly begun. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on December 18, 1986, just before Christmas, in the agricultural outskirts of Ventura County, California. Frost clung lightly to the ground that morning, rare for the region, but the cold fit the moment. The missing person flyers taped to grocery store windows and telephone poles for nearly 3 weeks suddenly gained grim clarity. The victim was 22-year-old Emily Joanne Harper, a retail clerk and community college student last seen during the Thanksgiving weekend. Her disappearance had unsettled the town, but not yet frightened it. That changed the moment the search ended in the grove. Emily Harper had grown up in the same county where she vanished. She was described in police summaries as reliable, punctual, and deeply routine-oriented. She worked seasonal hours at a department store in downtown Oxnard, often volunteering for holiday shifts to afford tuition. Thanksgiving week of 1986 was busy. Sales were high, parking lots crowded, and daylight faded early. Emily clocked out on the evening of November 29. She never arrived home. Her car was found 2 days later in a municipal lot near the Pacific Coast Highway. It was legally parked, unlocked, and showed no obvious damage. The gas tank was half full. Her purse was missing. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, and no eyewitnesses came forward initially. Local press framed the situation cautiously. A young woman missing during the holidays was tragic but not unprecedented. Law enforcement opened the case as a missing adult with suspicious circumstances, not yet a homicide. The shift from uncertainty to forensic reality came 19 days later. A utility worker inspecting irrigation lines noticed disturbed earth beneath a cluster of eucalyptus trees bordering the grove. Deputies responded, followed by investigators and a coroner's team. Emily Harper was identified through dental records later that evening. The autopsy would confirm what detectives already suspected. She had been deceased for weeks. Exposure, decomposition, and environmental damage limited immediate conclusions, but trauma consistent with homicide was present. The official cause would later be ruled as asphyxiation, with contributing blunt force injuries. No defensive wounds were conclusively documented, a detail that would complicate timelines. The case file grew quickly. Patrol logs, store schedules, phone records, and witness canvases were assembled methodically. Detectives reconstructed Emily's last known movements with care, relying on time cards, receipts, and traffic patterns. She had left work shortly after 9:30 p.m. Surveillance footage from the store parking lot was grainy but showed her walking alone to her car. No one followed closely enough to be identified. She drove east, away from home, a deviation that drew attention. Thanksgiving and Christmas framed the investigation in uncomfortable ways. Officers worked overtime while their own families gathered. The department faced public pressure amplified by the season. Editorials questioned safety. Churches organized vigils. The sheriff held restrained press briefings, careful not to speculate. Leads trickled in. A man had been seen arguing with a woman near a payphone. A suspicious van had idled near the parking lot weeks earlier. None held under scrutiny. By January 1987, the case went cold in the way most do, quietly and procedurally. Detectives rotated assignments. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and stored. Emily Harper's name faded from headlines but not from records. Her parents continued to call. Each Christmas, they asked the same questions. Each year, the answers remained unchanged. The investigation would remain dormant for decades, preserved in manila folders and aging magnetic tapes. What ultimately solved the case was not a confession, nor a dramatic tip, but a technological shift paired with persistence. In 2019, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office began reviewing unsolved homicides for forensic reevaluation. Emily Harper's case was among them. Advances in DNA extraction made it possible to test biological material previously considered unusable. During the original autopsy, trace evidence had been collected from beneath Emily's fingernails and from fibers found on her clothing. In 1986, these samples yielded no actionable results. In 2020, they were sent to a private laboratory specializing in degraded DNA. The process took months. When results returned, they indicated the presence of male DNA not belonging to any known associate. The profile was entered into national databases with no immediate match. Investigators then turned to forensic genealogy, a method still controversial but increasingly accepted under strict guidelines. With judicial authorization, the DNA profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database that allowed law enforcement access. Analysts identified distant relatives and began constructing family trees. The work was slow and meticulous, involving census records, obituaries, and birth certificates. The name that emerged was unexpected but local. A man named Robert Allen McCreary, 43 years old in 1986, had lived less than 5 miles from where Emily's car was found. He had died in 2015. At the time of Emily's disappearance, McCreary worked nights as a delivery driver during the holiday season. Investigators reviewed McCreary's history. There were no prior violent convictions, but several traffic stops placed him near the route Emily had taken that night. Employment records confirmed he was working the evening she vanished. His delivery logs showed a gap of nearly 90 minutes unaccounted for. That gap aligned with the estimated window of Emily's disappearance. Detectives contacted surviving relatives and obtained items belonging to McCreary for comparison. A discarded razor and a preserved personal letter yielded DNA consistent with the forensic profile. The match was confirmed by independent laboratories. In early 2023, the sheriff's office formally closed the case, identifying Robert Allen McCreary as the sole suspect responsible for Emily Harper's death. Because McCreary was deceased, no arrest could be made. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and issued a public statement affirming that, had McCreary been alive, charges of first-degree murder would have been filed. The case was officially cleared by exception, a designation used when sufficient evidence exists but prosecution is impossible. The announcement came quietly without spectacle in December, nearly 37 years after Emily Harper disappeared. Reporters noted the timing. Another Christmas, another ending, but not the one her parents once hoped for. They attended the press conference, seated in the back holding hands. They spoke briefly afterward, thanking investigators and stating that certainty, even delayed, carried weight. Emily Harper's name was removed from the unsolved cases list. Her file was archived with a final notation. The grove where she was found has since been developed, the eucalyptus trees replaced by asphalt and lighting. Shoppers pass the area unaware. The town moved on long ago. The record did not. For those who worked the case, resolution did not feel like victory. It felt procedural, necessary, and restrained. A gap closed. A question answered. The holidays returned as they always do, quieter for some, unchanged for others, marked by memory rather than mystery. By the time the case was officially designated inactive in late 1987, the investigative trail had narrowed to fragments rather than paths. The department's internal summary described the matter as unresolved but not abandoned, language commonly used to justify retention without active manpower. Emily Harper's file occupied 3 boxes, each sealed and indexed, then placed into a climate-controlled archive alongside dozens of other unsolved homicides from the 1970s and 1980s. The physical space itself reflected the era: concrete walls, metal shelving, fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly, and handwritten tags fading to yellow. Seasonal decorations appeared there too, cardboard snowmen taped to doors each December by clerical staff, a quiet contrast to the gravity of what those boxes contained. The early years following Emily's death were defined by procedural maintenance rather than progress. Detectives periodically reviewed the file, usually during slow periods or after related arrests elsewhere. Each review followed the same structure. Original witness statements were reread. Maps were unfolded and smoothed. The route from the department store to the Pacific Coast Highway was traced again with a finger. Nothing new emerged. The absence of witnesses at critical moments remained the central obstacle. Emily had vanished into an ordinary holiday night, one filled with traffic, sales, and distraction. That ordinariness made isolation possible. Public memory shifted as the years passed. New crimes replaced old ones in the news cycle. The Harper family continued to receive form letters from the sheriff's office confirming the case remained open. Each Thanksgiving, Emily's mother mailed holiday cards to investigators she remembered by name, a gesture noted in internal correspondence but never discussed publicly. The cards were placed in the file, a human artifact among documents. By the mid-1990s, forensic science began advancing in ways that hinted at future potential, but offered little immediate help. DNA profiling entered mainstream law enforcement, yet the samples collected in 1986 were considered too degraded for meaningful analysis. Environmental exposure in the Grove, combined with the passage of time before recovery, had compromised cellular material. Laboratory notes from 1994 reflect cautious optimism quickly tempered by technical limitations. The evidence was resealed, not discarded. The seasonal framing of the case never disappeared from institutional memory. Emily's disappearance between Thanksgiving and Christmas was repeatedly referenced in training materials about victim routines and offender opportunity. Holiday schedules altered patterns, extended store hours, increased travel, and reduced vigilance. Those factors were understood conceptually, but did not point to a suspect. The man responsible had blended into the background of holiday commerce, a figure indistinguishable from hundreds of others working late shifts, driving dark roads, and returning home unnoticed. As decades passed, the physical town changed. Oxnard expanded. Agricultural land gave way to development. Roads were widened, intersections redesigned. The municipal lot where Emily's car had been found was resurfaced twice. Original light poles were replaced. None of these changes affected the case directly, but they underscored its age. Investigators reviewing photographs from 1986 noted landmarks that no longer existed, a reminder that crime scenes do not remain static even when cases do. The turning point came not from a single decision but from a broader policy shift. In 2018, state funding became available for cold case review initiatives, specifically targeting homicides involving young victims. Emily Harper's age placed her within the priority range. Her case was selected based on evidence retention quality and the absence of identified suspects. A multidisciplinary team was assigned, including a retired detective familiar with 1980s procedures and a forensic specialist trained in modern DNA recovery techniques. The team approached the file without urgency but with discipline. Every item was logged anew. Chain of custody was verified. Evidence packaging was inspected for integrity. The biological samples collected during the autopsy were reassessed under current standards. What had once been deemed insufficient was now considered marginally viable. The distinction mattered. Advances in amplification and extraction allowed analysts to work with far smaller quantities of genetic material. Laboratory processing began in early 2020, coinciding with broader disruptions that slowed progress. Despite delays, the work continued. The resulting DNA profile was partial but usable. It excluded known associates and family members. It did not match any offender in criminal databases. That absence suggested either a first-time offender or someone who had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. The implication was unsettling but clarifying. Authorization for forensic genealogy required careful legal review. The department documented necessity, proportionality, and scope. Only after approvals were secured did analysts proceed. Public genealogy databases provided distant connections, not names. Those connections were mapped patiently, generation by generation. Birth records led to marriage certificates. Obituaries confirmed relationships. The process resembled archival research more than policing. Robert Allen McCreary's name emerged gradually, not as a revelation but as a convergence. His proximity, employment history, and age aligned. He had been 43 in 1986, physically capable, working nights and living alone. He had no criminal record beyond minor infractions, which explained his absence from databases. His death in 2015 initially complicated matters but did not halt the investigation. Investigators reconstructed McCreary's movements using surviving records. Delivery logs were retrieved from a defunct company's archived payroll system. Timestamps showed inconsistencies previously unnoticed. Fuel receipts placed his vehicle near the municipal lot on the night Emily disappeared. None of these details alone proved guilt. Together, they formed a coherent timeline. Physical comparison required reference DNA. Legal procedures were followed to obtain personal items from McCreary's estate. Laboratory analysis confirmed the match. The statistical certainty met prosecutorial standards. An independent lab replicated the findings. Documentation was exhaustive, anticipating scrutiny even without trial. The department prepared its closure report with restraint. Language avoided speculation. Conclusions were supported by evidence. The district attorney's review affirmed the findings. The case was cleared. The announcement was scheduled deliberately in December, acknowledging the timing without exploiting it. For the Harper family, the resolution arrived quietly. There was no courtroom, no verdict read aloud. There was documentation, explanation, and confirmation. Emily Harper's death was no longer an open question. Responsibility had a name, even if accountability could not be imposed. The aftermath was administrative. Records were updated, databases amended. The file was moved from unsolved to resolved. For investigators, the work ended not with celebration but with filing. Another case concluded decades late, during the same season it had begun. The formal closure of the Emily Harper case initiated a final phase that was less visible to the public but critical to institutional integrity. Internal audits were conducted to ensure that every investigative step taken decades later could withstand posthumous scrutiny. Supervisors reviewed the genealogy methods used, confirming compliance with state and federal guidance. Each warrant, consent form, and laboratory protocol was cross-checked. The objective was not only to close the case, but to do so in a manner that would endure as precedent for future cold casework. Media coverage followed a predictable arc. Local newspapers ran restrained headlines emphasizing resolution rather than shock. National outlets showed limited interest, noting the absence of a living defendant. The story resonated most deeply within the community itself, where memories of the missing posters and holiday vigils still lingered among older residents. Letters to the editor reflected a collective sense of belated relief rather than anger. The tone remained subdued, consistent with the way the case had always been handled. For law enforcement, the Harper case became a reference point in training seminars, not as a dramatic success story, but as an example of patience and evidence preservation. Detectives emphasized that the solution did not rely on intuition or chance, but on documentation maintained across generations of personnel. The boxes stored in the archive had mattered. The fibers, the nail scrapings, the handwritten logs, all seemingly dormant for years, had retained value precisely because they were preserved. The seasonal context continued to frame internal discussions. Investigators noted how the convergence of Thanksgiving travel, Christmas retail schedules, and shortened daylight hours created vulnerabilities that offenders could exploit without planning elaborate schemes. Emily Harper had been alone, but not isolated. She disappeared in plain sight. That lesson informed subsequent policy recommendations related to holiday staffing, parking lot surveillance, and employee safety briefings, particularly for late shifts. Attention also turned briefly to Robert Allen McCreary's background, not to humanize him, but to understand how he had avoided detection. His life, reconstructed through records, appeared unremarkable. He maintained steady employment, paid taxes, and interacted minimally with neighbors. There were no known complaints, no rumors, no prior accusations. This absence reinforced a difficult truth documented in criminological literature. Some offenders operate entirely outside existing profiles, committing a single act that leaves no pattern until uncovered by chance or technology. The legal outcome remained unchanged. With McCreary deceased, the district attorney reiterated that no charges could be filed. The clearance by exception was final. The language of the closing statement avoided moral judgment, focusing instead on evidentiary sufficiency. For some observers, the lack of courtroom accountability felt incomplete. For others, certainty itself carried weight. The justice system had reached the limits of what it could lawfully do. Emily Harper's remains had been interred years earlier, but the family chose to add a new headstone inscription acknowledging the case's resolution. The date of identification was included, a quiet marker of time elapsed. On the first Christmas after the announcement, the family did not hold a vigil. They spent the day privately. There were no public statements. Silence replaced uncertainty. Within the sheriff's office, the case file was digitized in full. Paper documents were scanned, photographs preserved, and audio tapes converted to modern formats. The physical boxes were retained but marked as resolved. Their placement in the archive shifted, now grouped with other closed cases, each representing a completed narrative rather than an open question. The broader cold case initiative continued. Emily Harper's case was one of several reviewed, but its resolution reinforced the program's legitimacy. Funding was renewed. Additional analysts were hired. The work remained slow and methodical, rarely producing immediate results. Yet the Harper case demonstrated that time did not necessarily erase accountability, only delay it. As years passed beyond the announcement, public discussion faded again. New crimes emerged. New investigations took precedence. Emily Harper's name receded into records rather than headlines. That transition marked the final stage of the case's life cycle. From disappearance to investigation to dormancy to resolution and finally to history. For those who encounter the story now, it exists as a complete account rather than an unresolved mystery. The facts are fixed. The timeline no longer shifts. Thanksgiving weekend in 1986 is understood not as an open-ended tragedy, but as the beginning of a crime that eventually reached its conclusion. Christmas, once associated with unanswered questions, now carries a different weight. The quiet aftermath is perhaps the most accurate measure of resolution. There were no appeals, no trials, no prolonged legal battles. There was simply an acknowledgement of truth, documented and verified. The community absorbed it and moved on, as communities do. The roadways remain busy during the holidays. Parking lots fill and empty. Shoppers come and go. Somewhere in the archive, Emily Harper's file rests among others, no longer waiting. It stands as a record of diligence rather than drama, of a system that did not forget even when it could not act. The seasons continue to turn. The case does not. In the years following the formal resolution, the Emily Harper case settled into its final, enduring state, a closed investigation that continued to influence quietly without demanding attention. The sheriff's office no longer issued updates, but the documentation remained accessible for audit, review, and historical reference. Each December, when internal case lists were circulated for administrative housekeeping, Emily's name appeared with a definitive status beside it: resolved. That single word represented decades of unanswered questions, now replaced with certainty. The conclusion of the case also brought subtle institutional reflection. Detectives who had once worked the file in the late 1980s, now retired, were contacted and informed. Some remembered the early canvases and the unease of searching farmland at dawn. Others recalled the frustration of stalled leads and the pressure of holiday schedules. None expressed surprise at the outcome. The absence of resolution had never meant absence of belief. The case had always been treated as solvable, if not immediately, then eventually. For the Harper family, the passage of time after resolution unfolded differently than the years before. The constant anticipation of new information ceased. Phone calls from law enforcement stopped. Media inquiries ended. What remained was a fixed narrative, no longer subject to change. Emily Harper was no longer missing, no longer an unsolved victim. She was a young woman whose life ended on a specific night, through the actions of a specific individual, now identified and recorded. That clarity altered the way holidays were experienced. Thanksgiving, once marked by memory and uncertainty, became quieter. Christmas decorations no longer felt out of place. The family did not celebrate in a traditional sense, but the tension that had accompanied each season for decades softened. The calendar no longer carried investigative significance. Dates were no longer counted in years without answers, but in years since resolution. The town itself absorbed the outcome without ceremony. There were no memorials erected, no streets renamed. Local history publications added a brief paragraph to their crime archives. Libraries updated their records. For newer residents, the case registered only as a historical footnote. For older ones, it closed a chapter that had remained open in the background of community memory. From a procedural standpoint, the case became an example of lawful closure without prosecution. Legal scholars referenced it in discussions about forensic genealogy boundaries and evidentiary thresholds. The documentation demonstrated that even when suspects are deceased, investigative conclusions must meet the same standards as those intended for trial. Evidence had to be verifiable. Conclusions had to be conservative. Assumptions were avoided. The record stood on its own. Emily Harper's story did not end with dramatic confrontation or courtroom judgment. It ended with files signed, statements issued, and a quiet acknowledgement of truth. That ending aligned with the nature of the case itself, restrained, methodical, and devoid of spectacle. The absence of sensationalism was not accidental. It reflected the way the investigation had always been conducted, prioritizing accuracy over attention. In later years, as technology continued to advance, investigators revisited other cases from the same era. Some yielded results, others did not. Emily Harper's case remained distinct not because of its uniqueness, but because of its completeness. Every known question had been answered within the limits of available evidence. There were no unresolved leads, no competing theories. The narrative had reached its conclusion. The environment where the crime occurred continued to evolve. The former grove was now indistinguishable from surrounding development. Seasonal weather patterns persisted. December still brought cooler air and earlier nights. Holiday traffic still filled the roads. The physical world moved forward, indifferent to the events of 1986. Only the records preserved the connection between place and history. Law enforcement agencies rarely speak of closure in emotional terms. Yet internally, the resolution carried a quiet sense of fulfillment. Not satisfaction, but completion. A responsibility honored, even if delayed. The system had functioned as designed, imperfectly and slowly, but ultimately effectively. Emily Harper's name remains in official databases, not as an unsolved entry but as a resolved case. Her age, 22, remains fixed. Her photograph remains unchanged. Time has moved around her, not through her. That contrast underscores the importance of resolution, not as an act of restoration, but as an act of acknowledgement. The final legal notation in the case file states that the suspect was identified through forensic evidence meeting prosecutorial standards, and that prosecution was rendered impossible due to the suspect's death. No further action required. Those words conclude the formal record. They are factual, unemotional, and complete. What follows is the quiet aftermath that accompanies most resolved cold cases. Life continues. Institutions adapt. Families remember. The case no longer demands attention, but it remains available for those who seek to understand how persistence, evidence preservation, and evolving science can intersect across decades. California in 1986 was a different place. So was law enforcement. So was technology. The resolution of the Emily Harper case bridged those differences, connecting a Thanksgiving weekend long past to a December announcement decades later. The span between them was filled with waiting, work, and eventual clarity. The story ends not with celebration but with stillness, a name no longer unanswered, a file no longer open, a community no longer wondering. The seasons return as they always have, marked now by memory rather than mystery.